All right, buckle up everybody, because today we're diving deep into the case of Michael Gargiulo, aka the Hollywood Ripper, or even creepier, the boy next door killer.
Hmm.
We're going to be looking at excerpts from his Wikipedia page today, trying to understand, how he got those nicknames and really get a grasp on his crimes.
What really gets me about Gargiulo is that on the surface, he just seems so normal. But his crimes were absolutely horrific. He was able to just blend in, fly under the radar for years, leaving this trail of violence. That's what makes this case so fascinating and terrifying.
Yeah, that whole duality thing. It's something I really want to get into today. So let's start with his early life. He was born in 1976
Hmm.
in Glenview, Illinois, and that's where he committed his first known murder at just 17 years old.
His neighbor, Trisha Pacaccio, she was 18. And tragically, she was found stabbed to death right on her doorstep. Such a normal, everyday setting for such a horrifying act of violence really sets the stage for what would become his MO later on.
It really does sound like a scene ripped from a horror movie. The girl next door,
Hmm.
murdered on her own doorstep. You mentioned a pattern, and it's interesting that after Paccaccio's murder, Gargiulo moved to Los Angeles in 1998. It almost seems like he was too, trying to escape his past, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's definitely possible. It's not unusual for criminals to relocate. Sometimes it's to try to evade detection. Sometimes they're just looking for a fresh start. But with Gargiulo, those dark tendencies just followed him to California, LA. That's where he really earned that Hollywood Ripper nickname.
Right, and that nickname really is powerful, isn't it? It makes you think of all these gruesome crimes happening
Hmm.
beneath the glamour of Hollywood. So what was it about his crimes in California specifically that earned him that chilling title?
I think it's a few things. First, the brutality of his attacks was just shocking. He stabbed his victims repeatedly, far more times than was necessary to kill them. This level of violence, it suggests, maybe a deep-seated rage, a need for control, pretty common characteristics in serial killers.
Right, and
Better
then
than the
factor in the
location.
location, right?
Better.
Hollywood, it creates this really unsettling contrast.
Yeah.
A place that's supposed to be all about dreams and aspirations, but actually it's a hunting ground for a predator.
Exactly. The juxtaposition of that Hollywood glamour with the darkness of Gargiulo's crimes really captured the public's attention and fear. And then
Mhm.
his victims were all young women. That further fueled the media frenzy. It tapped into those primal anxieties we all have about vulnerability and the dangers lurking right under our noses.
You mentioned the brutality of his attacks, and to really understand that, we need to look closer at his crimes in California, starting with the tragic case of Ashley Ellerin.
Ashley was 22 years old, living in Hollywood in 2001. She was found murdered in her own home, stabbed 47 times.
Okay, even just reading the basic facts of this case is disturbing. 47 stab wounds. I mean, it's not just violence. It almost feels personal, like a statement.
That's a really good point. Forensic psychologists will often analyze the number and location of stab wounds to get some insights into the offender's mental state. When you see overkill, where the violence goes way beyond what's necessary to kill, it can indicate a heightened emotional state, maybe fueled by rage or hatred or a desire for complete control.
So in Gargiulo's case, this excessive violence could point to a deeper psychological issue.
Possibly. And what makes Ashley Ellerin's case even more well-known is that actor Ashton Kutcher was actually supposed to go on a date with her that night. He even testified at Gargiulo's trial years later.
Wow. That adds a whole other layer to this story, this intersection of Hollywood celebrity
Yeah.
and true crime. It's like a real-life thriller.
It really is. Kutcher actually saw the crime scene through a window and mistook the blood for spilled wine. Imagine stumbling onto a horrific scene like that, completely unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded.
Yeah, that's got to be haunting. It really highlights how violence can erupt in the most unexpected places, even in a place like Hollywood that feels safe and glamorous.
It really does. And sadly, Ashley Ellerin wasn't Gargiulo's only victim in 2005. He struck again. This time, his victim was Maria Bruno.
Maria Bruno, another young woman living in L.A. Was there any connection between them, or was this another random attack?
So Maria Bruno, she was actually Gargiulo's neighbor
Mhm.
in El Monte. It's a suburb of Los Angeles. Like Ashley Ellerin, she was also attacked in her own home, stabbed 17 times. Again, that many stab wounds. It just points to that rage we were talking about earlier.
God, it's terrifying to think that he was just living right next door to her, blending into the community,
Yeah.
but hiding this dark side. How can you even wrap your head around that someone you might see at the grocery store or wave to across the street could be capable of such violence?
It's a scary thought, for sure. And it really gets at the heart of what makes serial killers so dangerous. They can compartmentalize. They
Right.
put on this facade of normalcy to hide their true intentions. That's often what makes them so hard to catch. They don't fit that stereotype of, crazed killer. They can be charming, seem helpful, and just blend right into society.
Normalcy becomes a weapon. It
Yeah.
lets them gain access and trust,
Exactly.
and then their victims become more vulnerable.
Exactly. And this pattern, these seemingly random, brutal attacks, it continued until 2008 when Gargiulo encountered Michelle Murphy. But her story's a little different. She survived.
Michelle Murphy's case, it always stands out to me, like a turning point in the whole story.
Absolutely. Michelle was attacked in her Santa Monica apartment, but she fought back like crazy. During the struggle, Gargiulo was injured, and he left behind some crucial DNA evidence. This is the break investigators have been waiting for.
So her bravery, her refusal to become another victim, not only saved her own life, but it also led to Gargiulo's capture.
Yes, she was so strong, so resilient. Her DNA evidence linked Gargiulo to her attack, but it also connected him to the murders of Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno. This was the concrete evidence law enforcement needed to arrest him.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, fighting back can make all the difference. And in this case, Michelle's courage might have even saved other women from becoming victims.
For sure. But there's another twist here. Remember that first murder back in Illinois?
Tricia Pacaccio, the one that seemed to start it all.
Right. So while Gargiulo was in custody for the California crimes, he was also charged with Pacaccio's murder. The DNA evidence from California helped connect him to that cold case from 1993.
Wow. So even though he moved to L.A., tried to escape his past, it caught up with him in the end, like karma, the consequences of his actions coming full circle.
It really does. It shows how far forensic technology has come and the dedication of investigators who never give up on seeking justice, no matter how much time has passed. This brought some closure to Tricia Pacaccio's family after all those years of waiting for answers.
Like a reminder that the past always comes back to haunt you, that you can't outrun the consequences forever.
You got it. And Gargiulo's trial in California, which started in 2019. It was huge news. Ashton Kutcher's testimony, recalling the night of Ashley Ellerin's murder, put the case back in the public eye and brought up that Hollywood connection again.
You talked about how serial killers can compartmentalize, put on a mask of normalcy. Did you find anything in your research about Gargiulo's life outside his crimes? Was there anything about his personality or his behavior that hinted at the darkness underneath?
That's a great question. And it's something investigators always try to figure out. There were some reports of Gargiulo acting strangely, like fixing neighbors' appliances without being asked. But a lot of people who knew him described him as normal, even charming. That's the danger, right? They blend in, they manipulate how people see them, and they don't seem threatening at all.
A wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly. And what makes it even creepier is that while he was in jail, Gargiulo supposedly hinted that there might be more victims out there. He supposedly said that just because his DNA was found at 10 murder scenes didn't mean he was guilty of all of them.
Wait a minute. He's suggesting there might be more victims than the ones he was charged with? That's chilling. It's like, you think you know how bad the monster is,
Yeah.
and then you realize
Yeah.
it's even worse than you imagined.
It really is. And investigators have to take that seriously. The idea that there could be other families out there still searching for answers, not even knowing that their loved one's case might be connected to Michael Gargiulo.
That's when this gets really complicated.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not just about the known victims. It's about this whole web of potential unsolved cases stretching back years, maybe even decades.
You got it. Investigating serial killers is really complex and often frustrating. They can move from state to state, change their MO, and leave very little evidence behind. And in Gargiulo's case, his comment just throws another wrench in the works. Now investigators have to consider that there might be a lot more crimes than they initially thought.
So there's some justice in his convictions for the California murders, but there's also this unanswered question, this possibility of more victims. It leaves you feeling uneasy, like the story isn't really over.
Exactly. That's how it often goes with these kinds of cases. There's a resolution in the legal sense, but the emotional and psychological effects, the ripple effects of the crimes, they can last for years, maybe forever.
All right, so we've talked about how brutal his crimes were, his ability to blend in, and the possibility of more victims. Let's talk about the legal side of things. What happened at his trial in California?
Okay, so the trial was in 2019, and the prosecution had a ton of evidence. They had DNA evidence tying Gargiulo to the crime scenes, eyewitness testimony from Michelle Murphy, even Ashton Kutcher's account of the night Ashley Ellerin was murdered.
Sounds like they had a really strong case against him.
Yeah, they did. And big win for the prosecution. The jury found Gargiulo guilty on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree murder for Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno, and 1 count of attempted murder for the attack on Michelle Murphy.
So after years of terrorizing communities and evading capture, justice was finally served.
It was a big moment. The verdict brought some relief to the victims' families after all that pain and uncertainty, and it sent a message that people who commit these horrible acts will be held accountable.
What was his sentence?
In 2021, Gargiulo was sentenced to death for his crimes in California, but his legal troubles weren't over.
Wait, he was sentenced to death, but it wasn't over. What happened?
Well, remember, he was also facing charges for the murder of Trisha Picaccio in Illinois. So, in 2024, Gargiulo was extradited to Illinois to face trial for that crime.
So even though he was on death row in California, he still had to face another trial and possibly another life sentence. If he was convicted in Illinois, it seems kind of unusual. I mean, why go through another trial when he's already facing the death penalty in California?
Well, it shows how complicated the legal system can be, especially with crimes that cross state lines. You see, each state has its own jurisdiction, its own laws, and in this case, Illinois wanted to get justice for Trisha Picaccio. Separate from what was happening in California, it shows their commitment to holding perpetrators accountable for each crime, regardless of other sentences.
Yeah, it emphasizes that every victim deserves justice, that their case matters. So, as we wrap things up here, what are the biggest takeaways from this deep dive into Michael Gargiulo's case?
Well, I think the most striking thing is that contrast between how Gargiulo presented himself and the horrifying nature of his crimes. He was incredibly manipulative, able to blend in, appear helpful and harmless, but underneath, he was dark and violent. This case is a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, that we can't always judge a book by its cover.
Absolutely. That boy next door killer, they name it, really hits that point home. It shatters the idea that we can easily spot dangerous people and forces us to confront the reality that evil doesn't always announce itself.
Exactly. And Gargiulo's case also shows how important forensic science and DNA technology are when it comes to solving crimes. Michelle Murphy's bravery in fighting back and giving that DNA sample, that was a key to connecting him to the other murders and bringing him to justice. Her story is a great example of how courage can have a ripple effect, how one act of defiance can change everything.
Like the butterfly effect. One small action, huge consequences. Michelle's decision to fight back, it had a massive impact, not just on her own life, but on the whole investigation.
Right. It's also a reminder of the lasting impact of trauma. The families of Gargiulo's victims, they'll always carry the scars of his crimes, and that question about whether there are more victims out there, it adds another layer of pain and uncertainty.
You know, it's funny, as we've been talking, I keep thinking about that. The possibility of more victims. It's scary, you know? Even with convictions and sentences, there's still unanswered questions. Unresolved pain, like the story's not really finished.
I know what you mean. That's often the case with these stories. They leave a lot of unanswered questions. And the impact of the crimes can last for years for the victims and their communities. Justice may be served legally, but the emotional and psychological healing, that can be a long and difficult journey.
So, as we finish up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this exploration of Michael Gargiulo and his crimes?
I hope they remember how important it is to be vigilant in our personal lives and in our communities. Gargiulo's case shows us that evil can hide in plain sight. We need to be aware, trust our instincts, and look out for each other. We can't afford to be complacent when it comes to safety.
Well said. It's a powerful message, this deep dive. It's been tough, emotionally heavy, but important. It's so important to talk about these stories, to learn from them, and to use that knowledge to help make the world a safer place. Thanks for joining me.
It was my pleasure, and remember, knowledge is power. By understanding these cases, we can help create a better and more informed future.